There's new evidence that the CIA knew of President John F. Kennedy's assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, at least 2 years before he allegedly killed the former commander-in-chief. In a new Substack post, independent journalist and author Jefferson Morley writes about an unnamed source's account of having discovered explosive documents while visiting the CIA Declassification Center.
Morley details how the sources inadvertently came across a JFK file that seemed to show the CIA intended to deceive the House Select Committee on Assassinations, known as the HSCA, as it investigated the JFK assassination. In his post on Substack, Morley writes, quote, "It was a blueprint for how to hide things from the public and how to prevent investigative committees appointed by Congress from seeing documents that might incriminate offices of the government." Imagine that. Here to discuss this revelation is Jefferson Morley, author of several books about the CIA. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, explain it in greater detail. What is the scoop here? What is this room? What is this file? Lay it out for us.
The source who approached me told me about the CIA's file room that they maintain at an office in Herndon, Virginia, and that he had seen this document about the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I've been writing about the CIA for 3 decades. I've been writing about the JFK files since they first started coming out in the 1990s. And this is the most significant story that I've ever run across. Because what it tells us is the CIA is still hiding information related to Lee Harvey Oswald and related to sensitive CIA operations in 1963 around Oswald. Now, what do those operations involve? We don't know because there's so much secrecy involved. But this story gives us a little glimpse behind the curtain. And what it shows us is there are still sensitive CIA operations related to JFK's assassination that are out of public view. And, you know, it's not supposed to be that way. We have a law on the books, very strong, good law.
I was going to say, wasn't there supposed to be this recent declassification of all of the documents relating to that?
That was a product of the 1992 JFK Records Act, which mandated that the government review and release all of its assassination-related material. And over the last 30 years, a whole lot has come into the record, and it's giving us a whole new understanding of the JFK assassination story and the role of the CIA in it.
Is this because this is an issue of national security? I'm sure all of our viewers have probably watched the movies, read the books, seen all the conspiracies online, but there's a question of whether or not the USSR was involved, obviously Cuba, there's conversations about the mafia, but you know, oftentimes when they redact information or don't release it, it's a national security issue. Does it still?
Or they say it's a national security issue.
Yes.
Well, then why would you withhold it? You know?
And it was interesting when I asked the CIA for comment, they did not deny anything in this that I reported in this, not about the document and not about the location of the JFK file room. So that gave me more confidence. That gives me a lot of confidence that the story's right. They don't have access to an easy way to deflect this. What we're talking about is something very real. And they use the national security justification to keep this stuff off limits. But, you know, the law is very clear. And when the CIA responded, they said, you know, we've released all the records directly related to the assassination. That's not the law. The law says the government has to release all assassination-related records. And the definition of assassination-related in the 1992 Records Act and in the way it was implemented in the 1990s is very broad. And it includes records directly related to the assassination, but it also includes records indirectly related to the assassination. So what the CIA is saying is we get to decide which JFK records get made public. And that's wrong. The law is very clear. They don't get to decide. The law decides.
And just to be clear, these are records that predate the assassination, or records of or knowledge of, awareness of Oswald that U.S. authorities might have had because of his trip to Russia, because of his ties to Cuba.
Yes.
That he was on, the theory being he was on their radar, they were paying some level of attention to him, and yet this catastrophe still happened.
And the background to my story is the books that I've written on the CIA, not conspiracy books about the JFK assassination. What the JFK's assassination looked like inside the CIA to the very top people. Nobody cares what Morley's theory is. What top people in the CIA thought, that's really interesting. And this story is another sign that Oswald was very well known to the top level of the CIA. They'd been watching him for 4 years, not 2. From 1959 to 1963, Oswald's whereabouts, his motivations, his political contacts, his personal life were all monitored by top CIA officials. The CIA denied all of this to the Warren Commission and to investigators, and they said, we didn't really know much about him. My story shows that that's just a cover story. They knew a whole lot about him, and they were trying to keep it away from the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which was starting to ask tough questions about, we want to see some of these records of these sensitive operations involving Oswald in 1963. And the CIA was quite hostile. The document that the source described to me shows, the source says, shows that they intended to deceive Congress. They intended not to share all the information at their disposal, and that they were pleased that Congress hadn't figured it out.
So during that time period, Oswald was in Mexico City, where,
yes.
just a reminder of history, that's where Fidel Castro trained with Che. They
yes.
were in that cafe, that famous cafe. They would meet every day. I've been there. It's kind of cool. And of course, they trained to invade, Cuba, and of course, it was miserable failure at first,
right.
and evolved into a success. Why would Oswald be there training or meeting with them in Cuba? Like, let's just go back and through this theory of why that was significant to the CIA.
Oswald showed up and visited the Cuban consulate and the Soviet embassy in Mexico City about 6 weeks before President Kennedy was assassinated. Both of those facilities were under tight surveillance by the CIA. In the Soviet embassy, there were 2 cameras pointed at the front gate. At the Cuban consulate, there was a pulse camera pointed at the door. So whenever that door opened, they took pictures. Very sophisticated, pervasive, redundant photo surveillance system. Yet the CIA told the Warren Commission, we didn't get any photographs of him.
That just couldn't be true.
No, it's not true. And Wynne Scott, the subject of my first book, wrote in an unpublished memoir that it was not true. He read the Warren Commission, and he said, no, that's not true. We had that embassy totally covered. He was very proud, and he didn't want anybody to think that he had missed a presidential assassin. No, Wynne Scott was a very powerful guy, one of the best CIA stations in the world. He was adamant. And later, 2 CIA people were interviewed by Congress, and they said Wynne Scott had shown them photographs, surveillance photographs of Oswald. So the House Select Committee on Assassinations said in 1979 that the CIA story wasn't true and that the CIA probably had obtained photographs of Oswald. Now, I'll tell you one more thing. I reported last year, I found a guy who worked on that photo surveillance space, a man named Andres Goyenechea. And we figured out his name from some declassified records that were only declassified a year or 2 ago. I found Andres living in Washington State, and he told me the story of this photo surveillance space, which was run by his mother. His mother was the man who manned the camera most of the time. He was a university student at the time. He would come home and relieve her. She would go run her errands or do that. Andres Goyenechea told me that his mother told him, I took Oswald's picture coming and going. No. And she remembered the face very clearly. She attached no significance to it. But Andres said, we knew very well who was an American, who was a Russian, we'd been doing it for years. We knew all the people who worked in that embassy. So after the assassination, when Greta Goyenechea saw Oswald, she told her son, yeah, I took his picture coming and going. So that's another nail in the coffin of the CIA's cover story, that we didn't really get a photo of him.
Go ahead.
So I was just going to say, this is, however many years ago the assassination was, now 60 years, and we're still just getting, we haven't gotten all of the information.
It's incredible.
It makes you probably pessimistic about what is going on now. For instance, we have a lot of questions about COVID, or take any subject, COVID origins. There were some assassination attempts against Donald Trump in just the last month. For COVID specifically, there was Congress ordered declassification of a lot of documents. President Biden signed it. What was actually declassified was basically a press release saying we don't really know anything. There's no way that's true. The FBI and the Energy Department have made different qualities. So is it going to take 60 or 80 or 100 years? In the Kennedy case, so many of the people who might want to hide something, they're dead by now, and we still can't get the information.
But isn't that because this is, I guess, the big question here that I'm thinking is this just because the CIA messed up and they don't want to show that they had weaknesses, or maybe even people who are aware and look the other way? Related to also, like you had mentioned before we came on, that Nixon had gone after the CIA, that he tried to blackmail them.
Yeah,
So,
in my third book, which came out in 2022, Scorpions Dance, Richard Nixon has a very tense meeting with Dick Helms, the director of the CIA, in 1971. And Nixon is bugging Helms for some secret documents about the Bay of Pigs, And like, why is the Bay of Pigs? It was like 10 years after the Bay of Pigs invasion, which failed, as you said. And you hear Nixon on the tape when asked why, he says, the who shot John angle. And he says that to the CIA. Now, Dick Helms understood very well what that meant, which was he was thinking it was at least possible that the CIA was involved, and so he wanted to know more from CIA records about, the CIA's role in the events of 1963. Right after Watergate, when the burglars are arrested, Nixon says to his aides, get Helms in here and read him the Riot Act and tell him that if he doesn't get on board with, quashing this story about the White House burglars, it's going to blow up the whole Bay of Pigs thing. Dick Helms blows up because he understands very well that Nixon is blackmailing him and saying, you go along with me or else something might come out about the CIA and JFK. That is the moment when Richard Nixon and Richard Helms part ways. Up until that point, they had been pretty good partners, but Helms understood after that Nixon was his enemy and that Nixon would resort to something like that to kind of prevail in their personal
like
relationship.
Trump and Pompeo.
I think it's often hard to tell whether there's some genuine, they're trying to hide something because there's complicity, or they're so practiced, they being the authority figures in law enforcement and CIA and national security, they're so practiced at deception, they would redact, a grocery store list just out of habit.
Yes.
So it could be because it's not malicious and they're hiding something, they have so much practice at doing that now, it's second nature.
A secret agency is going to keep secrets,
yeah.
Right? And especially sensitive secrets.
Yeah.
So a couple of points. One, the law is very clear. The CIA may say that, but if it's an assassination-related record, it has to be made public. And back to your earlier point, we do have this crisis of legitimacy in government. People just don't believe government statements. And that traces back to the Warren Commission and the, not very credible story that they told about a lone gunman who the CIA knew nothing about. That's a cover story, okay? They knew a lot about him. They followed him all the way around the world, and they followed him right to Dealey Plaza. What was going on? I don't know. I was in kindergarten at the time, right? I mean, and we can speculate, but the point is, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't want to speculate. It's the CIA's job to make the documents available.
Yeah.
And the importance of my story here is they seem not to have done that in this case.
One quick question before we wrap. You mentioned Edward Snowden in this,
yes.
And can you give us context around that?
Well, there's a live, living person, a JFK whistleblower. So how does he compare to other? Well, he's not a Snowden who went in and copied things and gave the files to reporters. I mean, he's like Snowden in that he's a citizen and he saw something that bothered him and thought that it should come out. So that, in that way. But no, he's not the source is not a Snowden. He's not a Julian Assange who's trying to tear down the world ruling class. He's not a deep throat, a guy guiding because he wants to advance his political ambitions. I checked the source out very carefully. The source is highly credible, and the source is just concerned that the law is not being followed. This record should be public. That's what he says. I agree.
Jefferson Morley, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll have more Rising right after this.